Chapter 13. Good and Evil, Personal and Mass Beliefs, and their Effect upon your Private and Social Experience. In this chapter, we will deal with some current beliefs involving your most intimate behavior and social connotations. Now, a state of grace. Health, wealth, white, Christian. Out of grace. Disease, poverty, black, not Christian. This is not a chapter heading, it is a diagram. Now, another one of the same kind. A state of grace. Indian or Oriental, proud poverty, brown skin, great mystic understanding, cosmic understanding. Out of grace. American, embarrassing riches, white skin, callousness, spiritual poverty and disintegration. Another category. A state of grace. Youth, intuitive understanding, knowledge, beauty, intellectual capacity, physical vigor, and unfolding future. Out of grace. Age, rigidity, mental and spiritual ignorance, ugliness, disintegration of mental capacity, loss of vigor, the closing of all doors to activity. Now, I outlined some opposing ideas held by many people, all involving concepts of good or evil being applied in areas in which they do not belong. The designations will make certain contrasts clear visually. The simple diagrams merely represent some general belief systems from the standpoint of quote-unquote moral values. Your ideas of good and evil affect not only your behavior upon others, but your activity in a community and in the world at large. Many believe, using the first diagram, that it is quote-unquote good and morally superior to be Christian, white, wealthy, and in excellent health. Now, though this does not appear in the diagram, the word quote-unquote male can also be added to the list of preferred attributes. Reality, then, is viewed through this system of beliefs. If you hold them, you will feel that those characteristics are given by God. According to the fervor with which you cherish these ideas, you will find that they enclose you, for in a very limited manner, they will define your concept of good. People entertaining such beliefs are often very religious in conventional terms. Countries emphasizing like beliefs send missionaries to quote-unquote convert those who are pagan and therefore inferior. Individuals feeling this way will be very uncomfortable when they mingle with others of a different race, creed, or color, and despite themselves may be revengefully conservative in dealing, for example, with problems of a community nature. They will consider poverty as a sign of God's displeasure, and be so inclined to leave the entire matter in His quote-unquote hands. They may speak with seeming compassion about the plight of others, and yet all the while consider that difficulty the simple result of inferiority or inequality. These people may be of any age. They may come from any economic development. Now, if you happen to be Protestant, white, male, American, rich, and healthy, at least within the framework of your beliefs, you can look at yourself with quote-unquote clear eyes. Your foundation is shaky indeed, but at least you fit within it for the moment. You will notice that I added quote-unquote Protestant to our value system, as well as quote-unquote American. If, however, you hold this group of beliefs and you fall short, that is, if in some way you do not fit in, then even within that system you are in trouble. Some of the components are more charged than others. A Catholic or a Jew possessing these beliefs is obviously out of step to some extent, and will feel guilty as he measures himself against them. A black man who accepts the same system is indeed in difficulty. If he happens to be a poor black man, he is in double jeopardy. In that chart of belief, disease, poverty, femininity to some extent, non-Christian concepts, and a non-Caucasian racial heritage are all considered wrong to one degree or another. Now, any intrusion of other beliefs here will be considered threatening. Both racial problems and religious dissension will be rationalized from the standpoint of these beliefs. Some of my readers may consider themselves quite enlightened, believing, for example, in reincarnation as a series of consecutive lives. However, they may then use that concept to justify their belief in the inferiority of other races. They may say that since an individual chose his or her problems in this life, deciding for instance to be born black or poor or both, that karma is being worked out. Therefore, such issues should not be adjusted through a change of law or custom. On the left side, looking at the second diagram, you will find people in this case and in this country of a more quote-unquote liberal frame of mind. But you will not find them quite as liberal if you understand that they are prejudiced in one direction as the first group is in another. Here we have a system of belief in which it is wrong to be white, American, or wealthy, or even at all well off in financial terms. All of the distortions in Christianity are apparent, where the first group is blind to them, of course. Here, though, wealth and white skin are not only bad, but obvious symptoms of moral deterioration. If the first system of beliefs sees money and goods as a sign of God's blessing, the second group views material possessions as evidence of spiritual decay. Here, the exotic is romanticized, the foreign held up, the picturesque seen as real. Black skin or brown skin becomes the criteria of spiritual perfection, and poverty a badge of honor to be worn not only proudly, but often to be used as an aggressive tool. The people who follow these belief systems think that they are right. Their living style, community affiliations, and political leanings will be in direct opposition to the quote-unquote white wealthy ethic. Now, if you happen to be black or brown, poor, and believe in this system, you will at least feel secure within it. If you are instead white and wealthy and hold such beliefs, you will think yourself quite inferior indeed, and do everything in your power to show how picturesque and liberal and open-minded and black or brown you can be, while still being white, fairly well off, and perhaps secretly addicted to your Christianity. You will doubtlessly have Buddhas tastefully displayed and Indian beads. Now, the third diagram can cut across the other systems of belief, of course. In the first two groups, there are many leeways. You may have 1, 2, or 3 preferred characteristics that correlate with your ideas, for example, but your concepts about age leave you no such freedom. For at one time or another, all of you, quote-unquote, if you are lucky in your terms, will approach old age. Many believe that it is a time of spiritual and physical deterioration, an era in which all those hard-won attributes of maturity vanish, and the reasoning faculties disappear like grains of sand held too long by the thinking hands of the mind. If life is seen as good in this system of belief, then youth is viewed as the crowning glory, from which summit there is no further journey except descent. The old are not granted characteristics of wisdom, but feared as evil, bad, undesirable, and frightening. To these people, senility seems a natural, inevitable end to life. As mentioned earlier in this book, many who follow such beliefs try to hide them from themselves, desperately attempting to be young. Youth and old age both have their place, and within the framework of your race, each play important roles. You are used to thinking in terms of heredity. In physical terms, and in a different way than you imagine, this is important. Certain Earth experiences, however, are dependent upon duration in time, and result as a consequence of the mind playing upon its experience through long Earth seasons. There are specific functions brought into operation quite naturally that are scarcely perceived by your scientists, much less understood. As the mind within the body clearly sees its earthly time coming to an end, mental and psychic accelerations take place. These are in many ways like adolescent experiences in their great bursts of creative activity, with the resulting formation of questions and the preparation for a completely new kind of personality growth and fulfillment. These would be quite apparent were it not for your current belief systems, through which the old are forced to interpret their experience. Many instances of expansion of consciousness and mental and psychic growth are interpreted by you as senility. No important correlations have been made between the subjective experiences of the old, particularly in quote-unquote senile conditions, with those of other ages involved in expansion of consciousness, whether natural or drug-induced. Any such sensations are immediately repressed by the old for fear that quote-unquote senility will be the diagnosis. The experiences, however, affect the right hemisphere of the brain, and in such a way that abilities are released in somewhat the same manner as in adolescence. The individual, when it is time then, begins to see beyond temporal life, to open up dimensions of awareness that in your terms he or she could not afford while involved in the intense physical focus of normal adult life. Unfortunately, the personality has no system of beliefs, as a rule, to support such an expansion. The natural therapies, both physical and mental, are denied. Drugs are often used as depressants, clouding the clarity of what seems to be distorted vision. This is one of the most creative, valuable aspects of your lives. Instead, the old are made to feel useless in your society. Often, of course, they share this value judgment, and their experience within your communities has in no way prepared them to face subjective experience. There are no teachers to guide them. Old age is a highly creative part of living. The connections between it and childhood are often made in a derogatory fashion, but the personality is in just as creative a state. I am speaking generally now, of course, for your living conditions so distort the natural situation. Even the chemical and hormonal changes that occur are those that are conducive to spiritual and psychic growth at that time. The joyful affirmation possible is denied to the old because of your system of beliefs. In certain terms, quote-unquote psychedelic experience cannot be explained within your limited frameworks of reference, not because such illuminations are beyond explanation, but because your present systems of belief are too limiting. So at whatever age, a revelatory episode is difficult to relate to others. In older age, however, no one is interested, and yet it is here, as in adolescence, that the greatest creativity may emerge but go unrecognized. This era could be more advantageous to the individual and to the race than any other period, were it recognized for what it is and understood. The peculiar chemical changes that occur are often precisely those that lead to greater conceptions and experience, but these are free from what you think of as practical application. There is a trigger set off then, an impetus in which the personality tries to free itself from time-space orientation, released from the usual necessity to participate in quote-unquote. The personality, again, looks at the nature of experience in its purest terms. In some previous civilizations, this was done within a natural framework, in which the old were cared for physically, while their words were listened to most carefully. Ideas of the quote-unquote wise old man and similar legends apply here, as do the mystical concepts of the powerful old woman. In their natural progression and left alone, the old understand their own quote-unquote visions quite well. Body and mind operate beautifully together. Your beliefs about age, like everything else, will form your experience, and your mass beliefs will affect your civilization. With the current concepts held by your society, men and women fear old age from the time of youth. If young adulthood is considered the epitome of life, blessedness, and success, then old age is viewed as the opposite, a time of failure and decay. Some of this has to do with distorted ideas of both the conscious and unconscious minds, using your terms now. Generally speaking, in a Western society, the conscious mind is seen as coming into its own in early adulthood, as the self rises from the bed of childhood unconsciousness into a critical awareness and differentiation. The appreciation of distinctions and differences is considered one of the greatest characteristics of consciousness, and so those aspects of it are valued. On the other hand, the equally significant assimilating, combining, correlating characteristics of consciousness are overlooked. In scholarly circles, and many that are not scholarly at all, the intellect is equated only with the critical faculties, so that the more diagnostic you are, the more intellectual you are considered. During Western years of adulthood, consciousness is focused most intently in one specific area of activity and physical manipulation. From childhood, the mind is trained to use its argumentative separating qualities above all others. Creativity is allowed to flow only through certain highly limited accepted channels. When an individual becomes older and retired, for example, the focus for that particular kind of concentration is no longer so immediately available. The mind actually becomes more itself, freer to use more of its abilities, allowed to stray from restricted areas, to assimilate, acknowledge, and create. Precisely at this time, however, the individual is told to beware of any such straying and to consider that kind of behavior a symptom of mental deterioration. Those following mass beliefs will find that their own image of themselves has changed. They fear that their very age or existence in time has betrayed them. They see themselves as leftovers, dim vestiges of better selves, and in their own system of value judgment they condemn themselves through the very fact of their continued existence in time. If they ever did, they no longer trust the integrity of their bodies. They begin to act out the drama in a script written by others, to which, however, they have acquiesced. It may not seem that there is any connection between that situation and your beliefs involving color, and yet the two are intimately associated. Now, you equate the color white with brilliant consciousness, good, and youth, and the color black with the unconscious, old age, and death. In this value system, the black races are feared, as basically the aged are feared. The blacks are considered the primitives. To them are assigned creative musical abilities, for example, but for a long time these were quote-unquote underground activities. They gave birth to acceptable musical productions, but were not admitted themselves into the concert halls of the respectable nation. In your society, therefore, the black race has represented what you think of as the chaotic, primitive, spontaneous, savage, unconscious portions of the self, the underside of the quote-unquote proper American citizen. The blacks were to be oppressed then on the one hand, and yet treated indulgently as children on the other. There was always a great fear that the blacks as a race would escape their bounds. Given an inch they would take a yard, simply because the whites so greatly feared the nature of the inner self, and recognized the power that they tried so desperately to strangle within themselves. Nations, like individuals, can have split personalities at times. So there was a give and take involved in which the blacks expressed certain tendencies for the country as a whole, while the whites expressed other characteristics. Both groups acquiesced to their roles. In larger terms, of course, each has belonged to other races in other times and places, or to be more accurate, in simultaneous existences one plays out the other's role. Applied to old age, the color black denotes a returning to those unconscious forces. Now, all of this so far is from the standpoint of the American and Western belief. It is simply the reality in which many of my readers are involved. In other quote-unquote underground systems of belief, however, black is seen as a symbol of great knowledge, power, and strength. When this is carried to an extreme, you wind up with devil cults, in which the poorly understood powers of creativity and exuberance rush out in distorted form. The undersides of consciousness are then glorified at the expense of the other white, quote-unquote, conscious and objective values. Yet in both of these systems, the old are denied their unique power, strength, and wisdom, and hence the civilization is robbed as well as the individuals within it. All of this is also connected with your beliefs about the waking and dreaming states, white being acquainted with the day, and black with the dreaming condition. Here again it is the old connection between the God of light and the Prince of Darkness, or Satan. All distinctions made at various levels of development, and having to do with the nature of the origin of the present consciousness. Through the ages again, underground philosophies have tried to combine the two concepts, usually going from one extreme to the other in combating the current ideas in historical terms. In some of these philosophies, the daylight is seen as pallid, for example, in comparison with the true brilliance of knowledge that illuminates the dream state, and black is the symbol then of secret knowledge that cannot be found with normal consciousness, or be scrutinized in the light of day. Here you find stories of black magicians, and once more, age enters in so that the legends of the wise old man or woman rise into folklore. Death is viewed in terms of value judgments of good and evil and black and white, the annihilation of consciousness being perceived as black, and its resurrection as white. The light of illumination is experienced as white, yet it often appears to delineate the darkness of the soul, or to shine in the black of night. So, in your terms of reference, the two are dependent one upon the other, changing their connotations according to your beliefs. In many ancient civilizations, the night with its blackness was revered, and the secrets of nighttime consciousness explored. Correlations were made in which such knowledge was used consciously in the daytime. The two seemingly separate aspects of consciousness merged, and there were flowerings of art and civilization that are, in your terms now, almost impossible to conceive. And in such civilizations all races were accorded their place, joyfully, and those of all ages were respected for their particular contributions. In such societies, the limited value judgments discussed in this chapter did not apply. Individuals or races did not have to take certain specific roles, acting out various portions of humanity's characteristics. Each person was allowed to be unique with all that that implies. This does not mean that humanity has fallen from that state of grace into what may seem to be a lower condition. It does mean that you have chosen to diversify functions and abilities, to isolate them, so to speak, in order to learn and understand and even to develop their peculiar natures. There are ways of assimilating your inner knowledge, your contrasting values of light and darkness, good and bad, youth and old age, and of using such criteria to enrich your own experience in a most practical fashion. In so doing, you will enhance not only yourself and your society, but the world at large. You will also recognize the state of grace in which you must exist. Let us look at some of those ways. An attempt must be made to correlate seemingly diverse aspects of experience, to combine ideas of light and dark, consciousness and unconsciousness, and so forth, not only in private, but mass experience. As mentioned in Seth Speaks, my earlier book, great distinctions are made between your waking and sleeping states. They are neatly divided, with little effort really made to relate the two. Many of you will not find it practical to alter your sleeping hours because of work commitments. Some of you will be able to do so, however, and those of you who are really interested in this endeavor can at least achieve some variation on occasion that will allow you to connect your sleeping and waking activities with far greater effectiveness. Those of you who are able will discover that a somewhat altered arrangement will work greatly to your advantage. I suggest a 6-hour sleeping block of time at one session and no more. If you still feel the need for a greater amount of rest, then a 2-hour at the most nap can be added. Many will find that a 5-hour steady sleeping period is quite sufficient, with a nap as required. A 4-hour block is ideal, however, reinforced by whatever nap feels natural. In such circumstances, there are not the great artificial divisions created between the two states of consciousness. The conscious mind is better able to remember and assimilate its dreaming experience, and in dreams the self can use its waking experience more efficiently. Often in the aged, you find such frameworks coming into being naturally, but those who awaken spontaneously after 4 hours consider themselves insomniacs because of their beliefs, and so cannot utilize their experience properly. Both the conscious and unconscious would operate far more effectively, however, under an abbreviated sleeping program, and for those involved in quote-unquote creative endeavors, this kind of schedule would bring greater intuition and applied knowledge. Individuals following such natural behavior would feel much greater stability in themselves. Within the general patterns I have mentioned, each will, of course, find his or her own particular rhythm, and some experimentation might be necessary until you learn the maximum balance, but the flow of vitality would be heightened. It is true that the patterns will have their own flow at certain points in your life. Following your own rhythm, longer or shorter periods will naturally ensue. Your consciousness as you think of it will be expanded through such practices. Generally speaking, 8-hour sleep periods or longer ones are not beneficial, nor in larger terms are they natural for the race. There is a give-and-take chemical reaction, or rather chemical rhythms of reactions, that are far more effective in the shorter sleep periods. Many of you sleep through periods that should be those of your greatest creativity and alertness, in which the conscious and unconscious are most beautifully focused and at one. The conscious mind is often drugged with sleep, just when it could be deriving its greatest benefits from the unconscious, and be able to poise most meaningfully in the reality that you know. In these instances, the beauty and illumination of your dream state can be clear in the conscious mind, and used to enrich your physical life. Contrasts in your experience will appear to you in their united clarity. Now, such a change in your waking and sleeping patterns very nicely helps cut through your habitual ways of looking at the nature of your own personal world, and so alters your conception of reality in general. To some extent, there is a natural and spontaneous merging, of what you think of as conscious and unconscious activity. This in itself brings about a greater understanding of the give and take that exists between the ego and other portions of the self. The unconscious is no longer equated with darkness or with unknown frightening elements. Its character is transformed, so that the quote-unquote dark qualities are seen as actually illuminating portions of conscious life, while also providing great sources of power and energy for normal ego-oriented experience. On the other hand, areas of ordinary behavior that may have seemed opaque before, cloudy or dark, personal characteristic behavior that was not understood, for instance, may suddenly become quite clear as a result of this transformation, in which the shadowy aspects of the unconscious are perceived as brilliant. Barriers are broken down, and with them certain beliefs that were based upon them. If the unconscious is no longer feared, then the races that symbolized it are no longer to be feared either. There are many other natural and spontaneous kinds of comprehension that can also result from the waking and sleeping rhythms that I have suggested. The unconscious, the color black, and death all have strongly negative connotations in which the inner self is feared. The dream state is mistrusted and often suggests thoughts of both death and or evil. But changed wake-sleep habits can, again, bring about a transformation in which it is obvious that dreams contain great wisdom and creativity, and the unconscious is indeed quite conscious, and that in fact the individual sense of identity can be retained in the dream state. The fear of self-annihilation, symbolically thought of as death, can then no longer apply as it did before. As a result, other individually built-up beliefs that depended upon the existence of such opposites also spontaneously break down. When you find yourself as alert, responsive, and intellectual in the dream state as you are in waking life, it becomes impossible to operate within the old framework. This does not mean that in all dreams that particular kind of awareness is achieved, but it is often accomplished within the suggested wake-sleep patterns. A certain beneficial and natural situation is arrived at, in which the conscious and unconscious minds meet. This occurs spontaneously, whatever your sleep patterns, but it is very brief and seldom remembered. The optimum state is so short because of the prolonged drugging of the conscious mind. Animals follow their own natural waking-sleeping schedules, and in their way derive far greater benefits from both states than you, and use them with greater effectiveness, particularly along the lines of the body's built-in system of therapy. They know exactly when to alter their patterns to longer or shorter sleep periods, therefore adjusting the adrenaline output and regulating all of the bodily hormones. In humans, the idea of nutrition is also involved. With your habits, the body is literally starved for long periods at night, then often overfed during the day. Important therapeutic information that is given in dreams and meant to be recalled is not remembered because your sleep habits plunge you into what you think of as unconsciousness far too long. The body itself can be physically refreshed and rested in much less than 8 hours, and after 5 hours, the muscles themselves yearn for activity. This need is also a signal to awaken, so that unconscious material and dream information can be consciously assimilated. Many of your misconceptions about the nature of reality are directly related to the division you place between your sleeping and waking experience, your conscious and unconscious activity. Opposites seem to occur that do not exist in actuality. Myths, symbols, and rationalizations all become necessary to explain the seeming divergences, the seeming contradictions between realities that appear to be so different. Individual psychological mechanisms are activated sometimes in terms of neuroses or other mental problems. These bring out into the open inner challenges or dilemmas that otherwise would be worked out more easily through an open give and take of conscious and unconscious reality. In the natural body-mind relationship, the sleep state operates as a great connector, an interpreter, allowing the free flow of conscious and unconscious material. In the kind of sleep patterns suggested, optimum conditions are set up. Neurosis and psychosis simply would not occur under such conditions. And in the natural back-and-forth leeway of the system, exterior dilemmas or problems are worked out in the dream situation, and interior difficulty may be solved symbolically through physical experience. Illumination concerning the inner self may appear clearly during waking reality, and in the same way, invaluable information about the conscious self may be received in the dream state. There is a spontaneous flow of psychic energy with appropriate hormonal reaction in both situations. You do not have energy dammed up through repressions, for example, and emotions and their expression are not feared. In your present system of beliefs, and with the dubious light in which the unconscious is considered, a fear of the emotions is often generated. Not only are they often hindered in waking life then, but censored as much as possible in dreams. Their expression becomes very difficult. Great blockages of energy occur, which in your terms can result in neurotic or even stronger psychotic behavior. The inhibition of such emotions also interferes with the nervous system and its therapeutic devices. These repressed emotions and the whole charge behind such distorted concepts about the unconscious result in a projection outward upon others. In your individual area, there will be persons upon whom you will project all of those charged, frightening emotions or characteristics. At the same time, you will be drawn to those individuals because the projections represent a part of you. On a national basis, the characteristics or qualities will be projected outward onto an enemy. Within a nation, they can be directed against those of a particular race, creed, or color. You do not simply come upon your sleep patterns. They are not the result of your technology or industrial habits. Instead, they are a part of those beliefs that caused you to develop your technological industrial society. They emerged as you began to categorize experience more and more, to see yourselves as separate from the spring or fountainhead of your own psychological reality. In natural circumstances, the animals, while sleeping at night, are still partially alert against predators and danger. There is within the innate characteristics of the mammalian brain, then, a great balance in which complete physical relaxation can occur in sleep, while consciousness is maintained in a quote-unquote partially suspended, passive yet alert manner. That state allows conscious participation and interpretation of quote-unquote unconscious dream activity. The condition gives the body its refreshment, yet it does not lie inert for such long periods of time. Mammals have also changed their habits to accommodate those conditions that you have thrust upon them, so the behavior studied in laboratories is not necessarily that shown by the same animals in their natural state. Taken alone, this statement can appear deceptive. The alterations in behavior are themselves natural, of course. Animal consciousness is different than your own. With yours, a finer discrimination is necessary so that unconscious material can be assimilated. All of mankind's developments, however, are latent in the animal brain, and many attributes of which you are unaware are latent in your own. The biological pathways for them already exist. In your current beliefs, again, consciousness is equated in very limited terms with your conception of intellectual behavior. You consider this to be a peak of mental achievement, growing from the quote-unquote undifferentiated perceptions of childhood, and returning ignominiously to them again in old age. Such wake-sleep patterns, as I have suggested, would acquaint you with the great creative and energetic portions of psychological behavior that are not undifferentiated at all, but simply distinct from your usual concepts of consciousness, and these operate throughout your life. The natural experiences of what you think of as time distortion, for example, occurring in childhood and old age alike, represent quite normal experiences of your basic quote-unquote time environment, much more so than the clock time with which you are so familiar. The patterns I have suggested, therefore, will bring you far closer to an understanding of the reality of your being and help you break down beliefs that cause personal and social division. Now, the long period of continuous waking conscious activity is to some extent at variance with your natural inclinations. It cuts you off from the spontaneous give and take of conscious and unconscious material mentioned earlier, and of itself, you see, necessitates certain changes that then make your prolonged sleep period necessary. The body is denied the frequent rest it requires. Conscious stimuli is overapplied, making assimilation difficult and placing a strain upon the mind-body relationship. The division between the two aspects of experience begins to take on the characteristics of completely diverse behavior. The unconscious becomes more and more unfamiliar to consciousness. Those beliefs build up about it, and the symbolisms involved are exaggerated. The unknown seems to be threatening and degenerate. The color black assumes stronger tendencies in its connection with evil, something to be avoided. Self-annihilation seems to be a threat ever present in the dream or sleep state. At the same time, all of those flamboyant, creative, spontaneous, emotional surges that emerge normally from the unconscious become feared and projected outward then upon enemies, other races, and creeds. Sexual behavior obviously will be considered depraved by those most afraid of their own sensual natures. They will ascribe it to primitive or evil or unconscious sources, and even attempt to censor their dreams in that regard. They will then project the greatest sexual license upon those groups they choose to represent their own repressed behavior. If sex is equated with evil, the other group will of course be considered evil. If the members of such a rigid group believe that youth is innocent, then they will deny sexual experience as having any place in childhood, and alter their own memories to fit their beliefs. If a young adult believes that sex is good but old age is bad, then he or she will find it impossible to consider exuberant sexuality as a portion of an older person's experience. In the dream state, the child and the old man or woman can exist simultaneously, and the individual is made quite aware of the full range of creaturehood. The wisdom of the child and the aged are both available. Lessons from quote-unquote future experience are also at hand. There are quite natural physical mechanisms in the body that provide for such interaction. You deny yourself many of these advantages, however, through the artificial alienation that you have set up by your present wake-sleep patterns, to which, again, your ideas of good and evil are intimately connected. Those of you who cannot practically make any alterations in sleeping habits can still obtain some benefits by changing your beliefs in the areas discussed, learning to recall your dreams, and resting briefly when you can, and immediately afterward recording those impressions that you retain. You must give up any ideas that you have as to the unsavory nature of unconscious activity. You must learn to believe in the goodness of your being. Otherwise, you will not explore these other states of your own reality. When you trust yourself, then you will trust your own dream interpretations, and these will lead you to greater self-understanding. Your beliefs of good and evil will become much more clear to you, and you will no longer need to project repressed tendencies out upon others in exaggerated fashion. Your attitudes towards sleep, dreams, or any alterations of consciousness are all colored to some extent then by beliefs concerning good and evil in your Western society. These emerge from the old Puritan work ethic. Quote-unquote, the devil finds evil work for idle hands. This kind of thinking by itself brings about an overall attitude in which rest is frowned upon and dreams are considered suspect. Daydreaming and even mild alterations of consciousness take on moral connotations. Such ideas are mirrored in your society in innumerable fashions, and in areas in which values of good and evil are not apparent. Active sports are considered good, however, but often contrasted to passive intuitive activities which are often then seen as bad. You insist upon a material product of some physically demonstrated kind. In that context, dreams or daydreams are not viewed as constructive or productive. Young people are urged to tackle life aggressively, but in the usage of the term, this means competitively. It also implies, and of course promotes, the direction of individual consciousness in an exterior fashion only. Not only is consciousness to be focused to the external reality, but within those limits it is still further harnessed towards certain specific goals. Other inclinations are frowned upon. Such individuals are trained to consider any alterations of consciousness, any seemingly quote-unquote passive endeavor, as dangerous to one degree or another. An artist will be tolerated only if his work sells well, for example, in which case it will be thought that the artist is simply trickier than most in discovering a way to make money. The writer is put up with if books result in either fame or fortune. The poet is scarcely tolerated, for usually his or her gifts bring neither. The dreamer, whatever his age, job, or family background, is considered most suspect, for it seems that he doesn't even have a craft to excuse his moral laziness. People with such beliefs will find it most difficult to understand the creativity of their own being. The work done in dreams, the multitudinous experience encountered there, will be invisible to them. They will have little regard or respect for the dreamers or visionaries of the world, and will be the first to leap upon those in their own generation who display such tendencies. For all of this, however, inner portions of each individual's being are not touched by those beliefs. The ideas will be reflected in their daily experience, certainly, and seem to be justified. Yet beneath, the inner self is quite aware of the great thrusting creativity that occurs in dreams, and realizes that the source of individual energy has nothing to do with such superficial concepts as the nature of good and evil.